Landon Rourke didn't call ahead. That was the first thing Blythe Decker noticed. Not the truck, not the two men he'd brought with him, but the absence of any warning. She was on her knees behind the main pen, threading new wire through a rusted T-post, when she heard tires on gravel that didn't belong to her. She had one good pair of gloves, and she'd left them on the fence rail 10 feet away. Her hands were bleeding in 2 places from the wire. She didn't stand up right away. Mrs. Decker. His voice carried across the yard the way men's voices carry when they expect things to stop. I think we should talk. She pulled the wire through, set the pliers down, then she stood up and turned around. Landon Rourke was 54 years old, broad across the chest, with the particular sunburn of a man who owned land and drove across it in an open vehicle rather than working it. He was smiling. He held a folder tucked under one arm, the way people hold things they already know you don't want to see. "I've made you a reasonable offer," he said before she'd said a word. She looked at him. She looked at the 2 men behind him, neither one familiar. She looked at the folder. She was 28 years old. She had $109 in her checking account and $31 in savings. She had 7 sheep that every rancher in Crale County called a waste of hay. She had wire cuts on both hands and red dirt under her fingernails, and a debt attached to this land that the bank was already moving on. "Get off my property," she said. That moment, that dry October morning, is where this story really starts. The letter from the estate attorney arrived on a Wednesday in February, while Blythe was working an overnight shift at a pharmacy counter in Albuquerque. She read it 3 times in the break room, sitting under fluorescent lights at 2 in the morning, with a cup of vending machine coffee going cold beside her. Her great-uncle Walt was dead. She'd known he was sick. She'd known in the vague way you know things about relatives you haven't seen since childhood, but she hadn't known it was close. She hadn't known much about Walt Decker at all. He was her father's uncle, and her father's side of the family had always occupied a peripheral space in her life. Christmas cards when she was small, a few photographs, a single visit to New Mexico when she was 9 that she remembered mostly as heat and the smell of juniper and a long car ride on a dirt road that seemed to go on forever. What Walt had left her, 87 acres in Crale County, a ranch house, 2 outbuildings, 7 sheep, and, according to the second page of the letter, $38,000 in outstanding debt against the property, with a bank review already scheduled. She sat with the letter for a long time. Then she called the estate attorney, a man named Gerald Foss, who spoke in the careful, measured tone of someone who had delivered this kind of news many times and knew the people on the other end were almost never prepared for it. He confirmed the debt. He confirmed the timeline. The bank would move formally in approximately 4 months if no arrangement was made. He confirmed that the sheep would be handled accordingly if she declined. "What does accordingly mean?" she asked. A pause, sold or dispersed with the other assets. She looked at the wall above her kitchen table. There was a water stain shaped like nothing in particular. "I'll call you back," she said. She drove out to Crale County 4 days later, leaving at 5 in the morning to make the drive before her evening shift. The county road turned to gravel 8 miles past the town of Mira Springs, and the gravel thinned to packed dirt before it reached the turnoff for the property. She parked where the ruts got too deep and walked the last quarter mile in boots she hadn't worn in 2 years. The land was high desert, flat in some places, dropping into shallow arroyos in others, scrub juniper and piñon scattered across the mesa in the particular sparse way of things that have learned to survive on almost nothing. The sky was enormous. The air was cold and smelled like dust and something dry she couldn't name. She heard them before she saw them. A low sound, not quite a bleat, somewhere between communication and quiet. She followed it around the back of the deteriorating wooden pen and found them standing together near a water trough in the thin morning sun. 7 of them. Compact animals, mid-sized, with long rough fleece hanging in irregular layers. One coat tight beneath, another looser on top, in colors she hadn't expected. Brown and gray and cream, one almost black, one a reddish fawn. Their faces were narrow and alert. Their ears stood upright. They looked at her with a directness that surprised her, the specific attention of animals that are not afraid but are paying close attention. The largest ewe, gray with a white blaze from her forehead to her muzzle, walked to the fence and stood there, not asking for anything, just looking. Blythe reached through the fence and placed her hand on the animal's forehead. The ewe held still. "Okay," she said. She accepted the inheritance 2 days later. She gave notice at the pharmacy at the end of the month. She packed everything she owned into her car and 2 duffel bags and drove south. The ranch house needed work. The east wall had a crack she could see light through on bright days. The kitchen faucet had a slow leak she fixed with a wrench and a washer from the hardware store in Mira Springs. The water heater worked, but made a sound at night, like something settling into resignation. One outbuilding had a roof that had started to go. She put a tarp over it and added it to the list. The list was long, the money was not. She'd spent her first week researching everything she could find about the breed. Walt's 7 sheep were Navajo-Churro, one of the oldest and rarest breeds in North America, brought to the Southwest by Spanish colonizers in the 1500s, and woven for centuries into the agricultural and cultural life of the Navajo people. They were dual-coated, drought-resistant, efficient grazers on sparse desert vegetation, and historically low maintenance, compared to commercial breeds that required regular intervention and supplemental feed. They were also, according to 3 agricultural registry databases and a federal breed conservation report she'd read at 2 in the morning, critically depleted in registered numbers. The line she kept returning to was buried in a table footnote. Active registered Navajo-Churro breeding flocks in Crale and adjacent counties, known 0. She looked at her 7 sheep every time she read that sentence. The question of reproduction she'd solved in her first week. Walt's records, found in a metal box under the kitchen sink, showed he'd borrowed a registered churro ram from a preservation program at the University Extension Office in Las Cruces 3 times in the previous decade. She called the program. They confirmed the arrangement was still active. She scheduled the loan for early spring, before she'd fully understood what she had, and that turned out to be one of the better decisions she made, without knowing it was. The first person to be openly dismissive was a man named Carl Bauer, who ran the feed supply in Mira Springs. She went in the second week to buy supplement minerals and made the mistake of mentioning the breed. Carl was maybe 50, with the comfortable authority of someone who had been right about things in this county long enough that he'd stopped questioning whether he still was. "Churro," he said, leaning on the counter. He said it the way people say words they've decided are a punchline. "Walt's animals." "Yes." "You keeping them?" "Yes." He looked at her for a moment the way people look at someone who has just announced a plan they've already dismissed. Those things don't produce, not like commercial, wrong wool type for most buyers. Meat conformation's wrong. Slow growers. You want to make money on sheep in this county, you run Rambouillet crosses. Their fleece runs $4 to $6 a pound at specialty fiber markets, she said. Registered heritage wool with documented lineage runs higher. I've seen contracts at 12. Carl looked at her. "Where'd you read that?" "Research," she said. He sold her the minerals without another word. She could feel him watching her car pull out of the lot. Her hands were in rough shape by April. She'd been repairing fence line in sections, working after the morning feeding and before the evening check, and the wire had done what wire does to hands that aren't yet hardened to it. She wrapped them in athletic tape and kept going. She was living off canned goods and eggs from 3 hens that had apparently survived in the corner of the outbuilding without anyone's attention for some time. She sold an old piece of equipment she'd found in the barn that turned out to be worth $60 to a man outside Mira Springs, which bought her another 3 weeks of mineral supplement. She didn't feel sorry for herself about this. She noticed that she didn't, which surprised her a little. The gray ewe with the white blaze she'd started calling Birch by accident. She'd said the word once when the animal appeared at the fence post one morning, and it stuck. She hadn't intended to name any of them. She named 3 others by the end of April and stopped fighting the impulse after that. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late April when Ramona Tsozi appeared at her fence line without any prior notice, which Blythe had come to understand was simply how people arrived in this county, as though calling ahead was a custom that had never fully taken hold. Ramona was old in the specific way some people are old. Not frail, not diminished, but textured by it, weighted. Somewhere between 70 and 85. She walked without a cane but moved the way people move when they have made long accommodations for their bodies. She stood at the fence and looked at the sheep for a long time without speaking. Blythe came up beside her and waited. "My grandmother had churro," Ramona said finally. She didn't look at Blythe when she said it. Her eyes were on Birch, who was at the near fence doing what Birch did, which was observe things. Before the government reduction programs, before most of them were gone. She said it without anger, but not without weight. It was the tone of someone stating a historical fact they have lived with long enough to no longer need to perform the grief of it. Ramona Tsozi had lived on the land 2 miles east for 40 years. She didn't say much more that first visit. She looked at the sheep. She looked at the land, the scrub, the arroyo edges, the shallow depression in the mesa where rainwater pooled in wet years. "Your uncle understood what he had," she said. "People keep telling me he was eccentric. People here think small is a problem." She nodded at the flock. "These animals have been living in dry and small their entire history. They don't need to be taught how. They know." She paused. "There's a drought coming. Has been building since last fall. Watch the weather." She had been watching, every morning. "Your neighbors' pastures are going to suffer," Ramona said. "Yours will too, but differently. The mesa scrub holds better than improved pasture in a hard, dry year. Churro browse. They find things in rock and scrub that commercial breeds don't know to look for." She turned and looked at Blythe directly for the first time. Her eyes were dark and very steady. "The land your neighbors have been improving for 30 years is not going to hold up as well as land that was never improved at all." She left without offering anything further. Blythe stood at the fence for a long time after. That evening she found the contact form on the Heritage Breed Registry website she'd been visiting for 2 weeks and hadn't yet submitted. She sat at the kitchen table with the lamp on and wrote carefully, describing the flock, the fleece coloring, the conformation, attaching the photographs she'd been taking since day one. She sent the form. Then she went to check on Birch. The drought arrived in full by June. She watched it happen from the mesa edge on clear mornings. The improved pastures in the valley went pale and then brown. Hay prices in Mira Springs went up twice in 8 weeks. She heard about it at the feed store and the post office, and the diner on the edge of town, where she ate once a week because it was the cheapest hot food she could justify. Every conversation had the same undertone, the low, steady anxiety of people watching their margins disappear. Her land held. Not perfectly, not without stress, but the scrub vegetation her sheep grazed was desert-adapted in a way that alfalfa and bluegrass were not. She watched the flock move across the mesa in the mornings and understood something she hadn't been able to see from inside it, that she was sitting on something everyone else had written off, and the writing off was precisely what had preserved it. The response from the registry came on a Friday morning, 6 weeks after she'd sent the form. She read it standing at the kitchen counter, and this time she didn't sit down. She stood very still. The registry coordinator was named Patricia Odom. Her language was careful and professional, but even careful professional language has sentences that land harder than others, and one of them read, "If the animals are as the photographs suggest, this could represent the only documented active breeding flock with registered churro lineage in your county, and one of very few in the broader region." She put the laptop down. She walked outside. Birch was at the near fence, doing nothing, which was her version of doing everything. "You have no idea," Blythe said. Birch's ears turned once. 2 days later, a truck came down the dirt road. A man she didn't recognize, heavyset, in a vest with a logo she half recognized, stopped at the gate. She walked out to meet him. "Heard you might have some old-type sheep," he said, not unfriendly. "Mind if I take a look?" She stood at the gate. "Who told you that?" He smiled in a way that didn't quite answer the question. "Word gets around. Nice piece of land you've got out here." She looked at him, at his truck, at the logo on the vest. "I'm not selling," she said. The smile shifted in a way that was hard to name. "Nobody's asking you to sell today, just looking." "Then you can look from out there," she said, and pointed at the road. She went inside and stood at the window and watched his truck sit there for 3 minutes before it reversed and left. She went back to work. She wrote to Patricia asking about formal registration procedures. She fixed the leak in the outbuilding roof she'd been taping over for 2 weeks. She fed the sheep. She checked the lambing records. She wrote everything down: grazing hours, body condition scores estimated by eye, behavioral notes, the browsing patterns she was starting to recognize as intentional. She wrote it all down because she had made a decision, not loudly, not with any particular moment of resolution, but quietly and irreversibly, somewhere between reading an email and putting a hand on an animal's back in fading afternoon light. She was not going to lose this. The trouble started the second week of October, and it started with Landon Rourke. She'd heard his name before she'd met him. It came up in conversations the way certain names do in small counties, not always attached to a full sentence, but always with a particular weight. Landon Rourke had 420 acres east of Mira Springs, the dominant ranching operation in Crale County for going on 15 years, and 3 members of the county water and range use board. He showed up at her property that Tuesday morning with 2 men and a folder and told her he'd made a reasonable offer before she said a single word. She told him to get off her property. She didn't open the folder for 2 days. When she finally did, she sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and read it twice and set it down. The number was not reasonable. It was the number you offer someone when you've calculated they're out of options and want to pay as little as possible to confirm it, enough to clear the debt and leave her with almost nothing. The kind of offer made to someone expected to be grateful for it. She folded it and put it in the drawer under the kitchen counter. Then she called Patricia Odom. "If I register the flock formally," she said, "what does that actually open up, practically?" Patricia was quiet for a moment. A registered Navajo-Churro flock with documented lineage qualifies for several specialty market designations: federal and state rare breed conservation grants. On the commercial side, specialty fiber buyers, heritage wool cooperatives, Navajo textile producers. The premiums for documented churro fleece are significant. The conversation is completely different from commodity wool. How different? I've seen specialty fiber contracts at $10 to $14 a pound for exceptional lineage with documented breeding history. Standard commercial wool in your region is running between $1.50 and $2.50 right now. Blythe stopped writing. She looked out the window at the mesa, at the late morning light on the rock, at Birch doing her slow patrol of the near fence. "What do I need to start the registration process?" she said. The process was neither fast nor cheap, though Patricia helped her identify which fees were waived under preservation designations. She built a binder over 3 evenings at the kitchen table: photographs, behavioral notes, grazing observations, a timeline of the flock's history as far back as she could trace it. Walt's records were in the metal box, and in 3 notebooks she found in the outbuilding stacked under a canvas tarp. She hadn't expected much. What she found made her stop for an hour. Walt Decker had kept detailed records for 19 years. Not sentimental ones, practical. Breeding dates, ram loan arrangements, fleece weights by animal by season, grazing rotation notes, observations about how the flock responded to different weather years. His handwriting was cramped and slightly uphill, and completely certain of itself. In an entry from 11 years ago, he'd written, "These are the right animals for this land. The county doesn't know that yet. It will." She sat with that for a while. Then she added the notebooks to the binder. The first lambs arrived in May, 6 weeks after the registered ram from the Las Cruces program had come and gone. 3 from Birch, healthy, alert, on their feet within 2 hours. Blythe had been awake since 3 in the morning checking. She sat outside in the cold with a flashlight and a notebook and wrote down everything: times, which ewe, how the lambs moved when they first nursed. Her handwriting got worse as the morning went on because her hands were cold. She didn't care. She called Ramona that evening. Ramona said, "Good," in the tone of someone who considers a short, accurate word entirely sufficient. By July, Blythe had 11 lambs, all healthy, all nursing. She updated the binder and wrote Ramona's name in the acknowledgement section she'd added without quite planning to. The certified letter from the Crale County Water and Range Use Board arrived on a Monday morning in late October. It notified her that her property had been flagged for a grazing impact review under the county's Watershed Protection Ordinance. She had 30 days to prepare documentation for a formal inspection. One of the 3 signatures on the letter, was a name she'd seen on the agricultural board notices at the feed store. She read the letter twice. Then she put the kettle on and stood at the window while the water heated, looking at the mesa, and understood she had made a mistake in thinking Landon Rourke was done. She called Ramona first. "He waited until your registry application was in," Ramona said. "He knows about it." Small county. Yes, he has 2 votes on the board. He needs 3 for a full suspension. A grazing impact review can run 60 days if the inspector is motivated. A pause. "What's your first contract delivery date?" Blythe looked at her calendar. 48 days. Silence. "What do I need?" she said. "Historical grazing records. Pre-existing land condition documentation. Evidence your management hasn't damaged the watershed." Ramona paused. "When the county tried to reclassify this mesa as overgrazed 12 years ago, Walt and I documented everything together to contest it. I kept the files." "Why?" A short silence. "Because Walt asked me to, and because I thought they'd be needed again." She brought the files the following afternoon. Ramona's records went back 18 years. Grazing condition assessments, photographs, watershed notes, correspondence from the county's own environmental review the year they'd contested the reclassification. They spread everything across the kitchen table and went through it for 2 hours. Ramona corrected her twice on rangeland terminology and once on a commissioner's name she'd gotten wrong. "This is solid," Blythe said. "It should be. We built it to hold." She also called Diane Morales, who had done wetland and range assessments in the region for 20 years and whose name Ramona had given her. Blythe hadn't planned the call. It was an instinct. "I have a grazing impact review," she said after explaining the situation. "I have historical documentation and my neighbor's survey records, but I don't have someone who can speak to the land use question in technical terms the board can't dismiss." Diane was quiet for a moment. "What you're asking is whether I'd provide a professional assessment of your grazing management as part of your compliance documentation." "Yes, I can't pay you what you're worth right now. I want to be honest about that." A pause. "I've been doing range assessments in this county for 20 years. Landon Rourke's operation requested an exemption from the same review process 8 years ago for his eastern acreage drainage project. The board approved it in 2 weeks. A short pause. "I know what this inspection is." She drove out on a Saturday and walked every inch of the grazing area with her equipment and orange notebook. This time Blythe walked with her because Diane asked questions as they went, about the rotation schedule, the browsing patterns she'd observed, whether she'd noticed any change in vegetation density through the drought season. Blythe answered each one with the specificity that 8 months of careful observation had given her. At the end of 4 hours, Diane sat on a fence rail and wrote for 15 minutes without stopping. Then she looked up. "Your grazing management is functioning as a net positive for this section of the watershed," she said, not looking up yet from her notes. "Your mesa scrub health scores are the highest I've recorded in this county this year, in a drought year." She looked at Blythe. An honest inspection of this property would not find a violation. It would find a model. "Will you put that in writing? You'll have a formal assessment report in 5 days. Cite it in your compliance documentation and include my credentials. If they want to challenge it, they'll need their own expert." A pause. "Harold Rourke knows who I am. He'd be arguing against me on ground I know better than he does." The attorney Ramona had recommended, Cecily Vance, out of the county seat, who knew more about Crale County land procedure than anyone Blythe had spoken to, filed a procedural objection to the inspection timeline extension on a Thursday. The request was denied the following Monday. The third board member had voted against it. Blythe found out from Ramona. She didn't ask about the chain. Some things in small counties ran on channels that worked better if you didn't examine them too closely. She went back to preparing the documentation. And then, sitting at the kitchen table on a Wednesday night going through the binder for the 4th time, the idea arrived, not as inspiration but as recognition, the way some ideas arrive, like finding something you've been looking for in a place you'd already looked. She called Ramona the next morning. "I'm opening the ranch," she said. "One day, public, buyers, the registry, range specialists, the county extension office, the neighbors, everyone." Ramona was quiet for a moment. That's a lot of organizing. I have 28 days. A pause. Joe Serrano, Ramona said. She works with Navajo textile cooperatives and independent wool buyers. She's been asking Patricia Odom for 2 years whether there's a verified churro source in this region. Another pause. And she knows what Landon Rourke's operation has done to the range on his eastern acreage. She's seen it herself. Blythe wrote the name down. She put notices at the library, the diner, the feed store, the post office. She called Patricia Odom, who said she'd drive up from Las Cruces. She called Joe Serrano, said she'd bring a colleague, and could she come early to look at the binder. Ramona brought 3 people from the tribal land office, who had been tracking the Navajo-Churro population decline for a decade. The morning of the open day was cold and clear, blue sky all the way to the horizon, the kind of November light that shows everything without softening it. Blythe was up at 4:30. She wasn't nervous exactly. She was the kind of focus that doesn't leave room for nervous. She was still in her work clothes, with red dirt on her boots, when the first car arrived at 8:50, and she considered going inside to change, and then didn't, because the whole point of today was to show people what this actually was. And what it actually was had dirt on its boots. By 10, there were 40 people on the property. By 11:30, over 60. She hadn't expected the neighbors. She'd planned for industry contacts, maybe 30 people, but there were ranchers from the valley she recognized and ranchers she'd never met. There was the woman who ran the hardware store in Myra Springs, who stayed 2 hours and asked more questions about grazing rotation than anyone else. There was Carl Bauer, who arrived at 9 and walked the entire property and stood at the fence looking at the flock for a long time, and who found her near the outbuilding at noon and said quietly, "Those $12 numbers you mentioned, back in February, I looked them up." He paused. "You were right." She nodded. She didn't make more of it than it was. Joe Serrano spent 2 hours with the binder and the notebooks before she said anything. She went through Walt's records, the way people go through things when they're genuinely reading them, turning pages back, comparing entries, holding the notebook at an angle to read a margin note. When she finished, she set the binder down and looked at Blythe. "I work with 4 cooperatives," she said. 2 independent buyers have been looking for a verified churro source for 3 years. What I've seen today," she stopped, started again. "I'd like to talk terms." Blythe looked at the 11 animals in the pen, the oldest ones not lambs anymore, moving with the particular confidence of young animals that have grown up on ground that suits them. At Birch at the near fence, watching the strangers with the alert, calm attention that Blythe had come to find privately hilarious and deeply reassuring. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "I can make time." The terms took 4 days to finalize. Joe came back with a contract covering a 2-year initial period with an extension option. The per-pound price was above the high end of the specialty range Patricia had quoted. The annual revenue, at minimum contracted volumes, was more than double what she needed to service the debt. With room left over. With room to fix the east wall of the ranch house, which had been her next impossible problem. With room for a part-time hand during lambing season, when the work got to a volume one person could not manage without cost. She read the contract twice, then she called the bank. The loan officer, a man named Bill Kraft who had been professionally kind to her for 8 months in the way bank officers are kind to people they expect to default, went quiet when she gave him the numbers. He asked her to repeat the annual figures. She did. "I'll need to see the actual agreement," he said, "but based on what you're describing," a pause, "the bank should be satisfied." She thanked him, set the phone on the kitchen table, stood there for a moment. Outside, the afternoon light was doing what it did in November on the mesa, going gold and long-shadowed, the scrub and rock taking on color that wasn't visible earlier in the day. The debt letter was on the table. The binder was on the table. The notebooks were stacked beside it. She made tea, too strong, the way she always made it. She sat down and opened Walt's first notebook to the first page. The Water and Range Board closed the grazing impact review on a Thursday morning, 17 days before her first delivery date. No violation found. Motion to close passed 4-2. Cecily Vance called her with the news. Ramona called 10 minutes later, before Blythe had called her, which told her Ramona had her own channels and had been watching. "It's done," Ramona said. "For now. He can file again. But he'd need new grounds, and he used his best argument this time. Blythe looked out the window. Birch was at the fence, conducting her morning survey of the near perimeter with the methodical focus of an animal that has decided this is her job. She'd heard through Carl Bauer that Landon Rourke's eastern acreage was in trouble. The improved pasture that had looked productive 5 years ago hadn't held through the drought, and the hay costs to carry his commercial flock through summer had run significantly higher than his projections. She didn't feel triumphant about this. What she felt was more complicated, something that recognized how much of Landon Rourke's certainty had been a mirror. If you believed what the county believed about this land, about these animals, about what counted as viable, you made the same calculations he had made. You got the same results. The first delivery went out in December. She was up at 4 to prepare. The one thing she hadn't accounted for was a stuck latch on the loading pen, stiff from an overnight frost. She fixed it with a wrench and some language she didn't use in polite company. And by the time Joe's transport contractor arrived at 7, everything was ready. She stood in the driveway and watched the truck go down the dirt road and turn onto the gravel and disappear behind the ridge. Then she went inside, made coffee, and sat at the table with her current notebook open in front of her. She wrote down the date, the animals, the weights, the conditions. She closed the notebook. She set her hands flat on the table and let out a breath that had been stored somewhere since February. She was 28 years old. She had the only documented registered Navajo-Churro breeding flock in Crale County. 11 ewes now, 23 animals total, growing on mesa land that everyone in the valley had called marginal and that had outperformed every improved pasture in the county through the worst drought in a decade. She had a contract and a heritage grant application in process, and a neighbor she trusted, and 7 notebooks of her own alongside Walt's 19 years of careful observation. She had a ranch house with a crack in the east wall she was going to fix in the spring, and a wood stove that ticked down at night, and a lamp she'd found at a yard sale because the overhead light was too harsh. She had wire cuts on her hands that had healed and rehealed and healed again, and she had stopped counting them. She thought about Walt's sentence. The county doesn't know that yet, and about what it took to hold something for 19 years without anyone else understanding why, on nothing but the conviction that patient and correct eventually outweighed loud and wrong. She thought about what it would have meant to him to know that someone had found the notebooks, that someone had read them, that the animals were still here, still on this land, and the land was still intact, and the thing he'd believed in without anyone's help had turned out to be exactly what he said it was. She thought she'd probably never be done thinking about that. She got up. She pulled on her jacket and her boots. She went out to do the evening check, walking the fence line in the last of the afternoon light with Birch moving alongside her on the other side, doing her own version of the same walk, which was what Birch did. The mesa was quiet. The scrub was exactly what it had always been, dry and sparse and adapted to itself, asking nothing of anyone, offering what it had to things patient enough to take it on its own terms. She did the full check, wrote her notes, came inside. She opened Walt's first notebook to the first page and started reading.